Hello all. Today's video is going to be about the Set 2 decks to beat, namely the Tier 1 and Tier 2 from the last video that I did, the tier list predictions for Set 2. This is going to be mostly Set 1 decks updated for Set 2, the tried and true decks that will have mostly small changes with small additions from Set 2. I'll go into what is being changed and why, and then with the addition of Han Green, because I think that is the most clear-cut deck from like a Set 2 deck that will be a competitive deck. I'm not doing meta calls in this video. I will be doing a part 2, maybe a part 3 that will include meta calls and new decks. So to start off, we're going to jump in with Sabine Yellow. This is pretty much still the same deck. It's going to have 6 2-drops in the ground, 6 2-drops in the air, plus the Spec 4 Soldier to break Sentinel if needed. So you can still, it's going to be the same concept as Sabine Green. You're either going to arena dodge into ground or arena dodge into space if you're going second, or if you're going first, you just run one out there and then see what happens, and then try to play to the other one. I think this is actually a lot more scary than Sabine Green because of Sneak Attack and how Sneak Attack interacts with Poe and Wrecker. Sneak Attack with Poe is going to be 8 damage. On turn 4 potentially, or on 4 resources, so turn 3 potentially. So Sneak Attack reduces cost by 3, so it makes Poe a 2 cost. Sneak Attack's a 2 cost, so you get it out for 4 resources on turn 3. Can go base with it and discard a card for 8 damage to the enemy base, which is just insane. Wrecker, similarly, Sneak Attack out. It's going to be a 7/6 Overwhelm for 5 resources. Combo that with something like Heroic Sacrifice or Surprise Strike, you're just getting to insane amounts of damage within a single phase. You do lose the unit, obviously, but this deck is going to be very much about pushing the damage in a way that your opponent can't interact well with. They might heal up over it, but eh. So other than Poe and Wrecker, the other new card is Cassian. I think Cassian's really well positioned in the 3-drop slot. The other 2 3-drops that were being considered previously were Ezra and Rogue Operative, and because they freedom fighters. I think the extra point of health on Cassian is very important because it's going to survive stuff like Bosk and Forlom, the 4 ambush units, and there's also now there's a new green heroic ambush that ambushes for 4-on-4, in addition to the set 1 conditional ambush, but that one's not as relevant. I think this is going to be an extremely powerful deck. The other change that I made is adding Kira for Spark of Rebellion. I think Spark of Rebellion was a little bit odd in this deck because you kind of want to save it, but you don't. And if you play it early, you could be messing up your curve by trying to fit a 2-resource play in. Whereas Kira, at least you're getting a 3/5 body? A 3/5 body with the play, being able to see their hand and then slow them down. It doesn't strip the card, which isn't as good because then they could just deal with Kira and play the card anyways. But I don't think it matters too much. I think it matters more that Kira comes out, you see their hand, and then you pick something that's going to slow them down enough by increasing its cost by 3, and then just push damage through. Other than that, it's pretty much the same deck, playing the same way. Do damage from hands, good tech with Bamboozle for stuff like Childson and stuff like Sabine Green with experience tokens, disabling Fang Fighter for problem upgrades like Traitorous or Frozen in Carbonite or Entrenched. Black 1 to refuel the hand when you're going against, not just refuel the hand, but also dig deeper when you need to find the right closing tools against slower decks, namely Event Control. I did drop down to 2 Wing Leader because I think Wing Leader is getting was getting worse towards the end of set 1 and is probably even more problematic in like a problem to play in set 2 because there's going to be ways to deal with the experience tokens that it's giving out. Moving on to Sabine Green. Again, very few changes. I don't think the Rebel package has moved away from it all in either of these decks. I think it's doing exactly what these decks want to do, and there's not really much to add to it. Cassian comes in as a replacement for Freedom Fighters because he has that +1 extra health. The other good thing about him is he can be surprise damage from your resource line for 5 since he enters play ready. It could just be like the last 3 damage you might need to push through in both Sabine Yellow and Sabine Green. I think Sabine Green's a little worse off in terms of pushing damage through because it lacks sneak attack. It does have Energy Conversion Lab, which is a big plus, but you can only use Energy Conversion Lab once, and in a lot of matchups it's not even going to last till Poe. And if it does last till Poe, it's probably going to be on Poe, and then you have Wrecker. You could say, okay, I'm going to play Timely Intervention, but then Timely Intervention, you're not playing a slow game. Timely Intervention is more about a slow game where it's going to be +1 resource, +2 resources if it's being played from the resource row. That's, for those that don't know, that's the ambush card, the 1 resource ambush card that can be smuggled for 2 and gives ambush to the next card you play. I still think that this is going to be a very good deck. I think it's going to beat Sabine Yellow in the mirror matchup because of ECL. Maybe it did beat Sabine Yellow in set 1, but with set 2, just how much damage Sabine Yellow can just push from hand, it's going to be scary. So maybe this actually falls off and Sabine Yellow just becomes the dominant deck. Maybe not. We'll have to see what happens. Not much else changes here other than the addition of Poe and Wrecker. I guess we could talk about, and this would be more for Sabine Yellow, like stuff like Hotshot Blaster and other cards. Like, why are they being excluded? And it's because, on one hand, they might not have the heroic trait like Hotshot Blaster, and on the other, just the quality of the cards from set 1 is higher for the most part, aside from, like, Poe being the obvious replacement for stuff like Steadfast Battalion, and then just being straight up something that could be added to Sabine Yellow, including Wrecker. Moving on to Boba Yellow. This list has been interesting to think about and work on and play. It's the first list that I've included Mercenary Gunship, and arguably the list that might not want it. To talk about Mercenary Gunship briefly, I think it's a very good card in a deck that is resourcing every single turn and is not the aggro deck. Because if you're the aggro deck, your opponent might take it more than if you're not. If you are the aggro deck, you normally don't want to be taking Mercenary Gunships because it's just kind of stall the game. There's going to be notable exceptions to this, like where it disrupts play. Like, let's say you can interrupt an Overwhelming Barrage, like your opponent's on 5 resources, and you're like, okay, I'm going to take the Mercenary Gunship. But then at the same time, the other player, the non-aggro player, just is like, okay, well, we're just kind of time-walking the turn. I'm going to take the Mercenary Gunship back and still do whatever I was going to do with it, whether it be trade into a unit, like probably trade into a unit if there's something in space, or they'll just maybe let them have it and then kill it with the Overwhelming Barrage anyways. It's definitely something that needs to be explored with Mercenary Gunship, but my gut reaction is that it's going to be worse in aggro and better in mid-range and control decks. However, in here, since it is Underworld, it does work with McClunky, so your opponent just takes it and then you McClunky it back to your hand and deal 3 damage, so that's kind of cool. Oh wait, sorry, McClunky says, this was actually an oversight in design. McClunky says return a friendly non-leader, not one that you own. It's a new adventure that says one that you own. Or not, it just says a non-leader that costs 6 or less. Mess up there. So maybe mercenary gunship, that spot is normally cartel spacer. Crap. Yeah, cartel spacer. I think it still might get replaced with that, even though it doesn't work with McClunky. I don't ever think you would use New Adventure on it. It does make what I was thinking here with McClunky a little worse, because I was thinking you could just bounce the mercenary gunship. But McClunky still works with Evazan. I think this is the deck. Unlike Boba Green, I think this is the deck for Evazan if he is going to work. And for McClunky to use with him, because you could just bounce him. You just go face with it. Use him as an aggro unit, a 3/3 that's shielded, that you're just going to be pushing damage to the face. And then if your opponent ever tries to deal with him, one, you can maybe just get the attack off before they have any resources tapped, where they attack and then pop the shield, and then you get him, and then you trade into something with him before they can untap resources. Or you use McClunky to bring it back to your hands, maybe play it again to replenish the shield, or probably just resource it. A New Adventure also can just, you're probably not using a New Adventure for that, but a New Adventure does work really well with stuff like Bodhi, the ambush units like Bosk and 4 LOM, Cantina Bouncer, that's Fire Spray, of course. So a New Adventure is looking like it's going to be really strong in this deck. Like, technically, if you bring in all 3 against the slower deck and you get all 3 in your hand somehow in a Fire Spray, like, this Wonderland scenario, you could Fetch Fire Spray, attack base, and then New Adventure it 3 times for 20 damage. I mean, it's not going to happen, but it's still a cool interaction. And in those cases where you're playing against slower decks, you have Bodhi Rook to use it with, and Bazine Natal to use it with, where you're just going to start stripping cards from their hand and messing with their curve while you're hopefully just curving out. Relentless Pursuit is replacing Waylay. I'm pretty sure this is right. I've tested it a little bit now, and it's felt really good, especially in the Boba flip turn, where you just capture anything they've done up to that point and put a shield on Boba. One thing this deck doesn't have that I am considering is Boba's armor. It is a little weird in this deck, because this deck is normally the aggro deck. It's trying to push face. It's not really going for board control, aside from ambush units and tempo units like Katina Bouncer. It can be very good, though. Like, it's 2 resources for +2 attack, and then makes your Boba tankier. It is something that I think should be experimented with more. It's just finding the spots. This deck is definitely tight on spots now. I did notably keep Viper Probe Droid, and the reason for this is I want 8 hits that are not Greedo, because Greedo dies to an ECL'd unit Sabine. I want 8 hits that can either trade with or... Well, trade with, essentially, or like kill something that attacks into them if the Sabine ever tries to go face. I don't want them to just have a value trade, because in aggro versus aggro, there will be instances where board, like trading on board, does matter, and I don't want to present them with any good trades. So the Viper Probe Droid plus 3 Mercenary and plus 3 Dr. Evazan is 8 units that they cannot attack into with their turn 1 play. Greedo being the exclusion because of the 1 health, and Sabine Wren can just kill him with the ping. Especially off like ECL, it's really not a good situation to be in. That's another reason why Crafty Smuggler isn't a good option, because she just ECLs the ping, pops the shield, and then the damage kills him. Another thing to talk about with this deck is No Good to Me Dead. I'm hesitant to drop any No Good to Me Dead because of how powerful it is versus opposing fire sprays and leader flips. Against Sabine, aside from potentially locking down Sabine, it could also keep K2SO tapped to stop his on death trigger going off. But like I said, this deck's really tight on spots with the new cards, so it is going to be interesting to try to figure out where it should be. This is where my testing has started with it. We'll see where it goes. Another thing I dropped, originally I started with Bobby Sapphire's list. I dropped the Scalp Bike. No, not Scalp. Swoop Racer? I dropped the Swoop Racer for the Gamorrean, essentially for 4 LOM, and then I changed the numbers around. 4 LOM becomes the 3 of, and Gamorrean Guards becomes the 2 of. The unit that was alternatively considered here was Jabba, but this is now less in tricks. Phantom TIE Fighter is another addition in the sideboard with Bazine. This is primarily to target event control, but I'm not really sure if event control is going to be too much of a thing. I'm sure people will still play it on a local level, and this deck does struggle into it, so then it does have access to the lurking TIE Phantom. It's just event control decks are not seeming like they're the way to go going into the new set. I guess they still, well, I mean, we'll talk about it when it comes up. It's the last slide is Boba Blue, and I do think that that's still, if there is an event control deck, that's still the only one to be played. So lurking TIE, Phantom, Natal, good anti-control, but then you have like New Adventure, which is also like you're just gonna, well, one for ones, but it's just more control over what's in their hands. So this deck is looking still very, very strong, and of the tier 1 decks, including Boba Blue, this one has the most new additions, the most new tools in its kit. Going into tier 2, this is probably the tier 2 deck that I'm the hottest on, although I still think it very much struggles with not being able to target both directions at once, namely the Sabine decks and the event control decks. I think the hope here is that, or not really hope, because I don't want event control to be out of the meta. I think it's very important for it to be in the meta. It's just going to struggle because Lurking TIE Phantom exists. Like, it might have to, again, we'll talk about it coming up. I like this deck a lot. I've playtested all the ones on this list. I think this is the one that I come back to being like, I want to play this more. I'm also, so the Relentless in my testing list is currently in the sideboard, and the Avengers are in the main deck, because it seems like event control is going to be less prevalent in the meta, but that depends on what your local meta shapes up to be. This is where the Mercenary Gunship can start to shine, because, you know, if they take a turn, spend a turn taking it, you just take it back, it just slows down the game. It feels pretty good so far. And then normally it doesn't even get to that point, it just trades into something in space. Gamorrean Retainer is replacing Viper Probe Droid. I'm not really sure if it's right. There aren't too many green units in this list. You can go Gamorrean Retainer into Super Laser Technician, and now your Gamorrean Retainer has Sentinel, which is kind of cool. It also, with Phase 3 Dark Trooper, now you have 2 Sentinels out, but they just kill the Phase 3 Dark Trooper first. Then it's just like, there's really not too many green units in this deck to work with it. That maybe should switch back to Viper Probe Droid. It's still lacking on 2-drops pretty heavily, Mercenary Gunship being the best addition, and we have to really see how that plays out. The 2-drop slot's weak. It's not really being played for that, though. You still have Power of the Dark Side. You still have a 3/3 Sentinel on turn 2 with Phase 3 Dark Trooper. I think Black Sun Starfighter, at least if you're if the, like, maybe either way, this is replacing Consortium Star Viper. It's losing the healing from Consortium Star Viper, but it's gaining Sentinel. It's also losing 1 health. These things may be relevant. So far in my testing, I've liked it a lot because it can be found off Vader. So when Vader's played, it can either hit Black Sun Starfighter for Sentinel in space or Phase 3 Dark Trooper for Sentinel in ground. I've also wanted to really fit in the 3rd copy of the Phase 3 Dark Trooper for the purpose of having, I can hit Sentinel in ground or space off Vader, as well as trading into something with Vader. It feels very, very good. Other than that, I think it's still very standard. I'd drop the Super Laser Blast for a Supreme Leader Snoke, bringing that in against decks that might become problematic with board states that would have need to be Super Laser Blast, and now hopefully the line now is to get Supreme Leader Snoke out and to reduce the damage that they could deal, and then hopefully there's still a board, because the issue with Super Laser Blast is that this deck normally has a board 2, and that you're Super Laser blasting away its own board. The upside of Super Laser Blast is it hits big units, and like it hits tall board states, whereas Supreme Leader Snoke really only mitigates wide board states. We'll see where it goes. I'm pretty hot on this list. I think it's going to be one of the better tier 2 lists going into set 2. This list I've been loving. I've been working on this list so much. There are some things that I'm still a little cold on. There are like some slots in the curve where I'm just like, this just feels mediocre. I wish there were better units. But with only 2 sets, this archetype doesn't really seem to be fully fleshed out yet. For example, Mace Windu is just kind of mediocre. I'm thinking about just dropping him for something else, not really sure what. Marauder, which I'll go into why Marauder can be good, but more often than not, it's just eh. Like, I mean, it's a 4/5 ambush for 5. The beautiful thing about Han is it just, you can always accelerate the curve if you need to, so you could have a 4/3 ambush for 4 with the Marauder. You could have a 2/4 Sentinel for 3 with Bright Hope if you need it. He works extremely well with Cassian Andor. You have a 3/3 in Cassian Andor and a 3/3 in Battlefield Marines, so you have 2 different 3/3 ground drops. I was considering... I'm still flip-flopping between the two, between Mercenary Gunship and Green Squadron. Green Squadron? Green Squadron A-Wing. Green Squadron A-Wing can be played with Han as a 1/1 with Raid 2. Mercenary Gunship cannot be played with Han. You have to use Han on whatever else you're playing with it. But I do like that Mercenary Gunship just trades into like nothing attacks into it without killing it, where Green Squadron A-Wing things can attack into it pretty easily and not die. In terms of the turn 1 plays, like there is that interaction with Sabine ECL where it's like, okay, whoever plays their A-Wing first just loses their A-Wing to the opponent ECLing an A-Wing. Aside from ECL, it's not terrible, because if they aren't ambushing something into it, then it does have the benefit of, okay, they're wasting an attack on the A-Wing, so it's kind of like pseudo-healing. But currently I'm on Mercenary Gunship. We'll see what happens with that. I think the main appeal for this deck is Great Dragon. The card is insane. It gives something that ramp decks have been lacking, which is a consistent way to deal with event control. Great Dragon just kills them. This deck could also make use of perpetual resources really well with Timely Intervention and Bravado. For example, Crate Dragon can come down for... It's 11 resources either way, where Crate Dragon can ambush with the... Well, it could be 10 with the Timely Intervention in hand. Basically, you can ambush the Crate Dragon, kill something, do as much overwhelm damage as possible, and that's probably going to push them to a high enough life total where when they play a card to deal with Crate Dragon, it just kills them. The other combo kind of thing is with Bravado, where you play Crate Dragon, you have another unit to trade into something, and then you play Bravado to untap Crate Dragon. So it's you play Crate Dragon for 8 with Han, and then use 3 resources after trading into something to untap Crate Dragon and attack. It's very, very hard for the slower decks to deal with, whether it be blue-green villainy or yellow-blue villainy, the event or unit-based control decks. Marauder gives a very cool line with U-Wing reinforcement. You could also hit Mace Windu off it, so that's another reason why Mace is in there. Marauder, the plan is you find, and this is also kind of another argument for Green Squadron A-Wing, because Mercenary Gunship isn't always the best polling. I mean, A-Wing really isn't either. But the line is you pull Marauder off of U-Wing, kill something with it. I mean, you don't even have to kill something with it, it's when played. So you just pull Marauder off of U-Wing, and then you have a Mercenary Gunship or Battlefield Marine with your turn, potentially your turn 1 play now being in your discard pile. And you pull the other one, and it resources the one in your discard pile, so it just pushes you towards that high resource combo with Great Dragon even faster. More often than not, though, with Great Dragon, it is just going to be coming out as soon as you can play it, so in that case, I mean, Bravado is just better, because then you could use it on the next turn. I'm still messing around with if Bravado and Timely Intervention should be in the deck, but they so far have been performing pretty well. Both of them have been performing well. This deck does seem to be playing very well into Sabine. I think it still needs to figure out Boba Yellow a little bit, namely how to deal with Fire Spray. Bright Hope just is kind of a roadblock for Fire Spray currently. That's why another one's in the side, and then the Assault Cruiser, although it's a turn too slow unless you double ramp. It could, like, if you ramp once, if you ramp once and with Han's ability, it does come out on 6. So, like, Assault Cruiser could end up finding its way into main. I've gone back and forth with having it in main. And then to talk about the ramp spell selection here, obviously, people have probably noticed that I don't have Resupply included. And that's because I think what this deck is trying to do, at least with Spark of Hope, maybe Price on Your Head becomes Resupply, is to ramp ramp at a cheaper cost. For example, on 4 resources, it's very easy to play Spark of Hope or Price on Your Head. Like, trade into the board first and then play Spark of Hope, or play Price on Your Head and then trade into the board. The latter there being a little finicky because you obviously want to be removing something at the start of the turn, and you can't do that if you're playing Price on Your Head. That might end up switching back to Resupply. I only recently made that change just to try this line out a little more. But so the line is with 4 resources, you do that plus playing a unit with Han, so then Han could play any of the 3 drops, or you could just play a 2 drop with it. And then Han flips that turn as well and can also interact with the board. It's felt pretty good as a way to ramp while also interacting with faster decks without having to resupply with the three resources that 3 resource resupply, messing up the tempo and curve of the game a little bit. Pretty often when you're playing against aggro decks, it's hard to fit in the resupply. Poe's really good in this deck. I mean, Poe with ECL. Wrecker is really good with this deck. Obviously, don't want to defeat a resource with it, but having the option to is very nice. I'm not really sure where this list ends up, but I have been enjoying it, and it does seem strong. Oh, two other things to note about the sideboard is I'm trying the Flamethrower, and I've been saying this card all day, but I can't remember the name. The card all the way in the bottom left. It's a 1/5 Raid 2 with Restore 2. It feels like I haven't played with it too much because I haven't played too many sideboard games against specifically Sabine, which that's what it's there for, or maybe some other aggro decks like Boba1 Yellow. Because the concept is you play it, it's probably going to get 1 attack off, which can put 3 damage into something, and Restore 2. And then if your opponent doesn't deal with it, you're going to get another Restore 2 off of it. When they're dealing with it, it's only dealing 1 damage back, so But it's basically just slowing down the pace of the game, allowing this deck to get to the later game plays. The Flamethrower, I haven't tested it yet, so that was the most recent addition. It seems like it might be really good. The concern there is things that interact with upgrades, which might be on the uptick for this set. Dealing 3 damage divided as you choose. So, and it's only like a 3 resource card gives +1/+1, and then you can divide 3 damage as you choose among ground units on attack. It seems very, very strong. It could be played. Let's say you're playing against a Sabine deck that goes ground, and you're also in ground, and they go into base first, and then you just drop this. I mean, they'll probably ping for base, but then you can normally just attack your unit into their base. Like, they'll probably ping base to action pass before playing their next unit. But if they did play a unit, you could potentially trade your unit into their unit while also using this to ping off the ground unit. I think ideally it's you just go base to keep your, because you don't, it would be a 2-for-2, which could be fine if you're trading into a unit and using the damage to kill something else. But I think the appeal of this is you just attack and kill their turn 1 play. And then you're left with, 4/4, whether it be Battlefield Marine or Cassian Andor, that they're probably going to have to be reasonably concerned about, because on the Sabine flip turn, it now just trades cleanly into Sabine, where it's like, okay, I'm going to apply 1 of the damage to Sabine, 2 damage to something else if it's there, and it's 4 attack to just kill it. In theory, I think it's good, but like I said, I haven't had the opportunity to test it yet. This list feels good. I also want to give a brief mention to something I was trying for fun earlier this week on Tuesday, or a few days ago, like 3-4 days ago. This is Sentinel Han. So it's just a bunch of all the green Sentinel units, and then Riken General that interacts with Sentinels. It's surprisingly good. This probably wouldn't be where I'm at if I were to update it again, but it can do some cool things where it's just like, okay, I'm just gonna get the general out early, especially if you ramp, and I'm just gonna start putting experience tokens onto things that have sentinels, so the opponent has to attack them, and then they just keep getting bigger. It was fun. I don't think it's it. I think this list is better, but this was fun to play. Worth experimenting with more. Onto Han Green. This has been an interesting list to update. I don't really like where set 1 Han was. I've thought there were some like pretty glaring holes in it. Namely, the 6 drops just feel weak. I think they still feel weak. There's only 1 of each of the new 6 drops from set 2 that I've included in here. The concept being here that you never really need 5 resource units, because Han is always going to put a resource into play on 5 resources so that he can deploy earlier. So then you really care about the 6 resources and the 7 resources. The 6 resources, because if Han gets interacted with, then you can't immediately go to 7. Then you're trying to play a 6. The 6s just still aren't that good. Like, Squadron Skirmishers, okay. 4/6 ambush, gets card advantage. Pretty respectable, but, nobody's going crazy for it, I don't think. Millennium Falcon, 5/5 ambush in space. Could do some cool things. Still, I'm not all too impressed by it. It could be smuggled as well. Nest, can't remember. Ernie's. Nest is also like, it's okay. It's a 5/4 that you're ambushing for. Like, you want to probably be ambushing with something that hits for more than 5 in these cases. And then it buffs up your other ambush units. There aren't too many in the deck. Like, it's not an ambush.deck, but there are enough where it is relevant. The other notable difference is Spark is supplemented with Kira. The mercenary gunship's making another appearance. This is, again, in an attempt to deal with the Sabines, with the slower decks having a 3/2 that they could play on turn 1 in space. This now gives this deck the potential to go Millennium Falcon on turn 1 to trade into a space on turn 1, or Mercenary Gunship. Greedo, like the other decks, I'm a little cold on at the moment, because I didn't talk about this earlier. I meant to. With Bo-Katan, Bosk as leaders coming in that both deal 1 damage, Sabine unit that could deal 1 damage, Vader already existing that could deal 1 damage. Playing a 1 health unit doesn't feel like the place to be currently. That's why I've been dropping Greedo down in a lot of decks to a 2 of. Maybe he should be, depending on like what meta, because I don't think Bo-Katan end up being decks in the long run, but going into a fresh set 2 meta, I am a bit concerned about running something like Greedo. In the sideboard, the man, I wish I could remember the name of that card. The 1/5 Raid 2, Restore 2 again. That'll come in versus aggro. Sneak Attack is something that I think should be played more in Han, especially if you're playing a shell that can run Fleet Lieutenant, just because it gives a lot of reach versus slower decks, namely Event Control, but also potentially Blue-Green Villainy, where you can, especially if they Laser Blast, so like against Event Control in particular, they super Laser Blast, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna home one with Sneak Attack, and because you could put if you haven't ramped, you could also just put the resource in with Han. You get home one out with Sneak Attack, that's 7 to the face, and it returns a Millennium Falcon that's 10 to the face total. It's really scary. If it's later in the game and they tap out for whatever reason, you can do that plus Surprise Strike for 13 damage. If it's with Fleet Lieutenant, it's with 9 uninteractable, because you play Sneak Attack, it brings in the home one brings in the Fleet Lieutenant, and the Fleet Lieutenant makes the home one attack for 9 immediately. So, yeah, I think Sneak Attack should always be in these decks. I think Change of Heart is also going to be very important for yellow decks because of Crate Dragon. At least the mid-rangey yellow decks, and maybe the aggro, like with not maybe, but like with Boba Yellow, kind of need a way to deal with Crate Dragon. Then if you take your opponent's Crate Dragon, I mean, that sucks for them because they're getting hit for 10, and whatever they play is going to deal damage. They're kind of just like stuck. It's Crate Dragon's going to be not only scary to play against, but scary to play in a meta that's probably going to have a lot of yellow. The only time you're not probably too concerned about it is if the yellow opponent's Boba Blue, where they don't really push damage until they're closing the game. In which case, Crate Dragon, if they take it, who cares? They push 10 damage through and then get it back. I am still a little cold on Han Green. I think, like the other Tier 2 decks, it's not stable enough to hit both ends of the spectrum consistently to deal with the Sabines and the Event Control decks. However, if Event Control starts shifting out of the meta a little bit, then this can just really focus in on dealing with the Sabines and the Boba Yellows, and then the list becomes refined for that, and it could be very scary. This I am extremely cold on. I have been doing very well with it, but but there's a big but. It doesn't feel good with Evazan, and I don't know, like nothing really feels good in place of Evazan. It's like you could go back to Viper Probe Droid, but then you're just playing a 3/2. It could Crafty Smuggler, but like, The Wookiee, but then this deck is going for board control, not face. I mean, the whole thing with Evazan is you play it, and you just go face. And you kind of force your opponent to deal with it. And then when they try to deal with it, you try to set that up so they can't get a bounty. It's also very bad against the control decks. Any deck that's playing blue, blue villainy is just gonna like run over it. Like, oh hey, I'm gonna play a Power of the Dark Side after you play that, and then untap and play another. Especially the blue green villainy, where it's just like, oh, I'm gonna Power Dark Side your Evazan, and this applies to the Boba Yellow too. I'm gonna Power of Dark Side your Evazan, and now I'm gonna play a ramp spell. Ha ha ha! Eat that, and it feels terrible. It's just with the Boba decks, Boba Yellow, Boba Green, they really do want a better 2-cost unit. It's just not clear if the Wookiee or Evazan are it. The issue with Wookiee is the bounty as well, to a lesser extent. Because at that point, you really want to get an extra health on the Wookiee to get an exhaust bounty, which could actually really mess up some lines, instead of just playing Viper Probe Droid still and having the 1 less health. Like, it gets around making opening, cool. Crafty Smugglers, which probably wouldn't be played anyways, now can't trade into the Probe Droid if it's a Wookiee. But then Shoot First exists, it's still probably going to be played, McClunky's going to be a thing, and that's going to deal through... It's, eh. 4LM has felt great in this deck, Relentless Pursuit has felt great in this deck, Maul has felt great in this deck as a way to finish, because this, of the mid-rangey decks, this is the one that's probably trying to turn on the gas the quickest. I think Boba Fett's armor has felt better in this than in Boba Yellow, because this deck's more so fighting for board control. But at the same time, like I said, it's still going to be turning face at some point. It's felt I'm not really sure where Boba's armor ends up. It's really good, but at the same time, it's hard to find slots for things currently. I mean, Boba Fett unit could also carry it, which is cool. Not much else has changed about this deck other than the sideboard. I think the sideboard is huge. Lurking TIE Phantom is a terror for event-based control decks, unless they're playing Inferno 4, so like specifically my version of Boba Blue, where it's trying to up the event count as much as possible. It's only running 15 units pre-board, and then against Sabine it does go down to 11, but it's only running 15 units pre-board. Lurking TIE Phantom, the only answer to it is make an opening that cleanly answers it. Other than that, it has to be entrenched. And then, especially in Boba Yellow just has so many ways, with A New Hope, it could just blink the unit and get the entrenched off of it. This deck is a little weaker to it, where it doesn't have a way to get the entrenched off the Lurking TIE Phantom, so the Lurking TIE Phantom is answered a little more cleanly. But I'm the point being, I'm not really sure we're Lurking, because Inferno 4 just kills it. But so then, like, Boba Yellow, most Boba Yellows are still playing Inferno 4, and I don't know. We have to see how it plays out. Natal is insane versus those decks, especially because you can smuggle it and then pull it out whenever you need to strip a card from their hand. That it's very concerning for control. So that was one of the weak points of this deck, one of the weak points of Boba Yellow, that is now slightly better with Bazine, well, a lot better with Bazine, and maybe Lurking TIE Phantom. We have to see where the deck falls. Especially with stuff like Mercenary Gunship and Boba Fett's armor. The last deck for this video is going to be my version of Boba Blue. You might be able to tell there's not a single new card in this list. I'm not happy about it. I'm figuring out what can be done. It could go more unit-based and move away from the Greedo and Bosk interaction with non-units. I don't particularly want to do that. There are some lines, because it's very much needed against Sabine with Greedo. There are some lines that Sabine has against Greedo, especially if they're running ECL with the Sabine unit. But this deck can play around that if it has Waylay. Because it needs Waylay of Power with the Dark Side to do that on turn 2, to untap something and play Greedo, whereas if Greedo's played on turn 1, especially if I have initiative and I'm playing Greedo on turn 1, they could just ECL Sabine into it, and the ping just kills it, and it feels terrible. At least then make an opening turns on turn 2, but then Greedo's not doing what he needs to do. The point there being that Waylay is very hard to drop. I was hoping for an event replacement for Waylay, and instead we have Frozen in Carbonite, which doesn't untap a resource, which is a huge issue. The other card that Frozen in Carbonite could come in for is Make an Opening, and Lurking TIE Phantom exists. Make an Opening's the only way to answer it without adding Inferno 4 or more space units. The deck, in my opinion, is not in a good spot with just the few with just Lurking TIE Phantom being an addition to the game. I really don't like that that card was made and that more ways to answer it that aren't units weren't printed. There should at least be one more. I guess I mean, the argument is Frozen and Carbonite does answer it, but then they just have, Boba Yellow just has a new journey and they just, okay, cool. I blink my unit and get rid of Frozen Carbonite. Like, and then it has to replace Make an Opening, which is needed versus Boba Yellow, or Waylay, which is needed versus Sabine decks. It feels terrible. I've started experimenting with more unit-based versions of this, and that doesn't feel great either. Like 4 LOM is nice, Cloud Rider is nice, like having these ambush units that could just come down and trade, and then you end up having to go into mercenary gunship so that you can trade into early space plays, like mercenary gunships, and then 7th Fleet Defender. It just feels clunky at that point, and it's just not anywhere near as good as this list once it starts going more unit based. But now this list has a bunch of issues. We have to see what happens with it. Also, the reason why Bazine Natal isn't in this and the Collector, I think it's the Collector, isn't in this. The 2/5 shielded action tap, give a bounty, heal 5 health. That card, honestly, I think that card's bad. I do have it in this list as a one of to kind of, I've been experimenting with it, but so far it's felt terrible. Like, you have to spend a turn playing it, that you're not interacting with your opponent's board, where like normally you play something that interacts with your opponent's board. Then you have to spend an action putting a bounty on something, and then have another way to kill it as well that's not your turn to play. I guess as the game goes on, it does get better. I have seen people heal for 10 with this. It's just the steps that they have to go, like with this, into a Vigilance to heal for 5 and remove the unit. It's just the steps to set that up normally take too long. Or the client, sorry, not the collector, the client. I don't know, maybe the client is a direction at least the blue-green villainy should explore more. So far, I'm a bit cold to it. But the reason why the client isn't in this list, again, is because we're trying to limit the unit count. Is it Dr. Perishing or something as well? Like the 2 resource 0/5 tap to draw cards. There are ways, like in addition to 4LM, Cloud Rider, the client, there is definitely a unit-based list that I will be working on at some point. I'm just of the opinion that it's not going to be good enough to compete with the other high-tier lists. So with that, that does close out part 1 of this series, something like that. I will be back with updates to the Metacall tier, as well as potential upcomer decks for the leaders that I had listed lower than that, but I'm not really seeing those coming together. There's a Kira blue list that I've been working on that does seem pretty cool. I think that's it. I mean, the boss green list, people probably have heard of that. It doesn't seem consistent enough. Bo-Katan blue. There's definitely a lot of new lists popping up. They just haven't felt good enough. And what I'll be doing with these lists is I'm using these lists as the baseline. And then any new deck has to be played into these and do well against the majority of these to be, like, in my opinion, considered playable. If it does well into a few of these, maybe it can be added to, like, Metacall in some capacity, like the Tier 3 category. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I will be back with more soon. Hit the bell if you want to be notified right when they go up.